When the envelope first arrived at my door, I remember how carefully I held it in my hands, as if it contained something rare and delicate, a treasure meant to be preserved rather than opened. It was heavy, embossed with shimmering gold letters that gleamed under the light of my hallway lamp, and there was a faint perfume to it, the kind of artificial sweetness that lingers too long in the air. At first glance, it carried the elegance and promise of an important occasion, a celebration that one should feel privileged to attend. Inside, tucked neatly within folded layers of thick paper, was the wedding invitation from Claire, a girl I had known for years, though never with the closeness she seemed to suddenly impose on me by naming me as one of her bridesmaids. It felt flattering, almost intoxicating, as though I had been chosen for a role in a grand performance where beauty and loyalty would be displayed in unison. But there was something about the sharpness of her words on the card, the phrasing that seemed less an invitation and more a decree, that struck me even before I realized the full extent of what it meant. I can recall sitting on my couch, the envelope torn open beside me, rereading the list of events leading up to the wedding. Engagement party, bridal shower, rehearsal dinner, ceremony, reception, each one written with ornate detail, a script of expectations already set in stone. Yet tucked between the decorative calligraphy were hints of something sterner, rules cloaked as instructions, demands hidden beneath flourishes of gold ink. Formal attire required at all times. Attendance at all rehearsals is mandatory. All bridesmaids must conform to the planned aesthetic. It was as though Claire wasn't simply inviting us to witness her marriage, but commanding us to serve as set pieces in her meticulously curated fantasy. At first, I laughed softly to myself, imagining that perhaps I was reading too much into it, that it was just the way Claire always phrased things. She had always been a woman who liked control, who measured her worth by the scale of her events and the shimmer of appearances. But the more I turned the card in my hands, the more I felt the weight of something heavy beneath the glamour. This wasn't going to be a simple celebration of love. This was going to be a show, and we were all to play our parts whether we liked it or not. Over the following days, messages began to circulate. Claire had created a group chat specifically for her bridesmaids, a space where instructions trickled in like orders from a commander. What had begun as a golden invitation on my coffee table evolved quickly into a contract I hadn't realized I had signed. I could feel the shift in tone with every passing message, the way she outlined not only what we would wear, but how we would look, how we would behave, even how we would pose in photographs. "Consistency is everything," she wrote one evening, and though her words carried the polite veneer of a host, the undertone was sharper, colder, leaving no room for interpretation. I should have known then that the invitation was less an honor than a trap, that behind the glitter and the promises of celebration lay something darker, a transaction disguised as friendship. But I wanted to believe in the old memory of Claire I carried, the girl I had once shared classes with, who used to laugh freely before her laughter became a weapon of superiority. I wanted to believe that being chosen meant something genuine, that perhaps this was her way of reaching out, of reconnecting, of valuing me. So I held on to that hope, even as the demands began to multiply and the rules became increasingly rigid. The day I bought a dress according to her specifications, a pale shade that washed me out and clung uncomfortably to my skin, I felt the first sting of unease. I stood before my mirror, turning side to side, seeing not myself, but an outline of someone else, a shadow pressed into a mold that didn't belong to me. I imagined the other bridesmaids going through the same ritual, slipping into costumes that erased individuality in favor of Claire's vision. And though I smiled at the reflection, though I sent her the confirmation picture she required, inside there was a small crack forming, a whisper of doubt that told me I was already surrendering pieces of myself to her control. Still, I convinced myself it was temporary, that all weddings demanded some sacrifice, that these were the normal compromises of standing beside a bride on her most important day. But deep down, beneath the excuses and the rationalizations, I knew there was something different here. It wasn't about celebration or tradition, it was about power. That golden invitation hadn't been a gesture of affection. It had been a summons, gilded in perfume and ink, meant to lure us into her orbit so she could hold us there, spinning under her rules, until the performance was over and she had taken everything she could from us. I placed the invitation back in its envelope and set it on the shelf in my living room, where it remained for weeks, its golden edges catching the light every time I passed by. It looked beautiful there, a symbol of luxury and importance. Yet every time I saw it, I felt that same heaviness press down on my chest. I didn't know then just how deep the trap would go, or how costly that one card would become, but a part of me already sensed the truth, that beauty, in Claire's hands, was nothing but another means of control, and that I had stepped willingly into her stage, without realizing that the curtain had already fallen over me. The messages began arriving not long after the golden invitation had been set on my shelf like a relic, glowing but heavy with implication. At first they were polite in their tone, short announcements trickling into the group chat Claire had so carefully curated. Just a reminder, ladies, we're going to make this the most beautiful wedding anyone has ever seen. The words seemed harmless enough, an echo of the grandeur she had always sought in everything she touched. Yet beneath the sparkle of her enthusiasm there was a firmness, a rhythm of command that became more pronounced as each new directive unfolded. Soon the chat resembled not a circle of bridesmaids, but a council of subordinates waiting for instructions from their superior. And Claire, reveling in the role of orchestrator, delivered them with the precision of someone who believed every detail of the universe bent to her will. The first comprehensive list appeared on a Tuesday evening, when most of us were still tired from work and craving silence rather than another glowing screen. Here are the official bridesmaid requirements, the message began, attached to a document that stretched across several pages. As I opened it, I felt the weight of those words, official requirements, as if this were not a personal event, but a corporate contract we had been tricked into signing. It began with the attire. Each bridesmaid would wear an identical dress, custom-made from a boutique she had handpicked, the shade chosen to complement her own gown, rather than our individual skin tones or preferences. There would be no variations, no substitutions, no exceptions. Next came the shoes, a specific brand and heel height, not simply suggested but demanded, with links to the store and the exact product codes to avoid any mistake. Jewelry was to be minimal yet uniform. Earrings and bracelets provided by her but purchased at our expense, their cost justified as a contribution to the vision. Our hair was to be styled in the same sweeping design, regardless of length or texture, and our nails painted in a muted shade of pink she had decided would photograph best against her bouquet. The document moved on to expectations of behavior: arrive early to every rehearsal, always remain available for photographs, and most notably, never outshine the bride in any way, whether in clothing, demeanor, or even in conversation. There was an almost laughable clause about refraining from drawing attention away from her during the toasts, as if joy itself needed to be rationed and delivered only to her on demand. But the part that made my breath catch came at the end, beneath a bolded heading labeled Beauty Protocol. There it was, written with unapologetic clarity: professional makeup services, booked exclusively by Claire, mandatory for each bridesmaid, cost set at $850 per person, to be paid directly to her chosen vendor. The words were followed by a chilling line that seemed to echo in my head long after I had closed the document. If you cannot afford this, please do not embarrass yourself or me by attending. It was not phrased as a suggestion or an option. It was a threat wrapped in etiquette, a demand cloaked in the illusion of choice, and the cruelty of it gnawed at me more than the sheer absurdity of the price. The group chat lit up with hesitant responses, emojis masking discomfort, polite acknowledgments disguising resentment. One bridesmaid wrote, "Of course, anything for you, Claire," followed by hearts and champagne glasses. Another replied with a nervous laugh, "Well, I guess I better start saving now." No one openly challenged her, not yet. The silence between the lines was deafening, a silence born from fear of exclusion, fear of being cast out as disloyal, fear of losing the fragile thread of acceptance that came with the title of bridesmaid. I read and reread the words, feeling as though a noose was slowly tightening around us all, drawing us closer to her control with each feigned expression of support. I tried to rationalize it at first. Perhaps this was simply her way of ensuring uniformity, of keeping her vision intact. Weddings were expensive, after all, And maybe she thought that by dictating everything she was saving us from indecision or chaos. But no matter how I spun it in my head, the truth remained bitter. This was not about harmony or aesthetics. This was about power, about bending others to her will, about testing how far she could push before someone snapped. And the cruelest part was how easily we allowed ourselves to be bent, how quickly we folded under the weight of her expectations, even when they pressed against reason itself. That night, I sat alone in my living room with the glow of my phone reflecting off the walls, scrolling through the endless messages of agreement and false cheer. I could almost feel the collective exhaustion of the other bridesmaids, the way we all typed with clenched jaws, pretending to be honored while calculating what bills we might have to delay to afford this charade. I wondered if anyone else was silently angry, or if I was alone in the storm that began brewing inside me. The invitation had already felt like a trap, but this was the lock snapping shut, the moment the illusion of choice dissolved into obligation. I closed the chat without responding, leaving Claire's words to simmer on the screen, her rules etched into the glow like commandments carved into stone. Somewhere deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the list would grow longer, the demands harsher, and the price, both financial and emotional, more unbearable with each passing day. But for now, all I could do was stare at that line again and again. If you cannot afford this, please do not embarrass yourself or me by attending. And in that sentence, in that small yet devastating decree, I realized what Claire truly wanted was not just bridesmaids but disciples, willing to sacrifice themselves at the altar of her vanity. It is one thing to read a demand written on a list, tucked neatly at the bottom of a document, and it is another thing entirely to hear it spoken aloud with the sharpness of finality, delivered like a blade to cut off any remaining thread of doubt. When Claire's voice rang through the group chat on a late-night call, her tone was so cold and certain that I felt as if the walls around me tightened, as though she had reached through the screen and taken hold of each of us by the throat. She repeated what she had already written, but this time there was no room to twist her words, no possibility of pretending they were softer than they were. Makeup is $850 each. If you cannot pay, don't come. I don't want excuses. I don't want apologies. I don't want anyone cheapening this day. It is better to stay away than to embarrass me. Her voice was like steel wrapped in silk, a tone so polished and rehearsed it almost sounded rehearsed for a performance. But beneath the elegance was cruelty, and every one of us heard it. I remember the silence that followed, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, of your own breathing, because no one else dares to fill the air. There were no protests, no hesitant questions, no one willing to push back against the absurdity of the demand. Instead, one by one, voices rose in false agreement, each word dripping with the forced sweetness of submission. Of course, Claire. Whatever you need. We'll make it perfect for you. The words sickened me, not because the other bridesmaids believed them, but because they didn't. I could hear the strain in their voices, the cracks hidden behind polite tones, the way they yielded not out of loyalty but out of fear. Fear of being cast aside, fear of being labeled unworthy, fear of the shame that Claire had already promised to deliver if we failed her in any way. I wanted to speak. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would slice through the pretense and force her to see how unreasonable, how vile she was being. But I didn't. The words hovered on my tongue, trapped by the weight of expectation, pressed down by the knowledge that if I spoke out, I would be the one left in the cold, cut off not only from her but from the others as well. Because that was the truth. Claire had made herself the axis of the group, and to oppose her was to risk losing not just her approval, but the approval of everyone caught in her orbit. So I stayed silent, my voice joining the chorus of false compliance, my anger hidden behind clenched teeth. Later that night, lying awake in the stillness of my room, her words replayed in my mind. If you cannot pay, don't come. The cruelty of it wasn't only in the cost, though the cost itself was staggering, obscene, a sum that could have covered rent or groceries for months. The cruelty was in the way she delivered it as though it were natural, as though it were the simplest truth in the world that friendship was conditional, that presence was transactional, that the value of loyalty could be measured in dollars and displayed in flawless photographs. She wasn't asking us to share her joy. She was selling us a seat at her performance, and the price of admission was our dignity. I thought of the other bridesmaids, women with families, with debts, with quiet struggles I knew Claire had never considered. One had a child in school, another was between jobs, and yet here they were, nodding and smiling, agreeing to a burden that would press them down in ways Claire would never feel. To her, $850 was nothing more than a detail, a line item on the endless budget of a wedding designed not for love but for spectacle. But to them, to us, it was a weight that dragged us toward resentment, a silent chain we carried even as we pretended to wear it proudly. The next morning, I woke with a tightness in my chest, the words still echoing like a chant I could not escape. I tried to convince myself that it was just part of the process, that all brides demanded too much, that this was simply the nature of the role I had accepted. But the rationalizations fell apart as quickly as I built them, because deep down I knew this was different. This was not the nervous excess of a bride caught up in the whirlwind of planning. This was cruelty, pure and deliberate, designed to test the boundaries of our compliance. It was a warning as much as it was a demand. Prove your worth, or disappear. I looked again at the dress hanging in my closet, pale and lifeless, and felt a strange dissonance. It was supposed to represent unity, sisterhood, a collective bond in support of a friend, but now it looked more like a uniform, the clothing of soldiers in someone else's war, forced to march in line without question. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. The golden invitation, the rules, the makeup demand. None of it was about us. None of it was about friendship or love, or even about the wedding itself. It was about her, and her alone. Every choice, every demand, every word was designed not to celebrate, but to control, to elevate her image at the expense of everyone else. The cruel order had been given, and we had all obeyed. But as I stood there in the quiet of my own home, I felt the first stirrings of something I couldn't quite name. Not yet anger, not yet rebellion, but something raw and restless. Something that whispered to me in the silence left by her words. Something that told me this story wasn't finished, that the cruelty we had accepted would not go unanswered forever. For now, though, all I could do was carry the weight of her demand, heavy and suffocating, as the days moved steadily closer to the wedding that promised not joy, but humiliation dressed in silk. In the days that followed Claire's cruel declaration, the group chat remained alive with chatter, but it was not the kind of chatter that breathed life into anything. It was hollow, punctuated with emojis that rang false and comments so carefully measured they might as well have been written by the same hand. The silence beneath those words was louder than anything spoken, a silence made of resignation and fear, of a collective decision to obey rather than confront. I read their messages again and again, searching for any crack in the facade, some hint that I was not alone in my disbelief, that someone else saw what I saw, felt what I felt. But every response was wrapped in compliance, every phrase delivered with a bow. We're so excited. This is going to be unforgettable. Claire, you're a genius for planning all this. The praise was relentless, as though each bridesmaid believed that if she praised loudly enough, she might shield herself from the weight of expectation pressing down on all of us. I knew some of them outside the confines of this digital performance. I had shared coffee with Jenna, who worked 2 jobs just to keep her small apartment. I had seen Melissa juggle bills at the end of each month, her laughter strained as she joked about stretching pasta into endless meals. I had listened to Sarah talk about her daughter's daycare costs, and how even an unexpected doctor's visit could break her fragile budget. These were not women for whom $850 was a trifle. For them, it was a decision between comfort and debt, stability and desperation. Yet none of them spoke the truth. They smiled in messages. They agreed with Claire's demands, and they let their silence carry the weight of their unease. When I met Jenna by chance a few days later, her mask slipped for just a moment. We were standing in line at a grocery store, and her phone buzzed with another update from Claire, reminding us of payment deadlines. Jenna sighed, her shoulders sagging under the invisible weight, and whispered, "I don't know how I'm going to do this." The confession was fleeting, as if she regretted it the second it left her mouth, but it was enough to show me what I already knew. Behind every cheerful emoji in the chat was someone breaking apart, someone who wanted to scream but chose silence instead. When I tried to offer a small smile of solidarity, Jenna quickly shook her head, as though warning me not to say more, not to risk turning private suffering into public dissent. The silence became its own kind of weapon, wielded not by us, but by Claire. She fed on it, mistaking our compliance for devotion, interpreting our lack of protest as proof that her demands were justified. She grew bolder, her tone sharper, her orders more exacting. And the more she pressed, the quieter everyone became, as if each woman believed that blending into the background was safer than standing out. It was a silence born of survival, but in its stillness, it created something far more dangerous: complicity. For by refusing to speak, we allowed Claire's cruelty to harden into authority, and in doing so, we gave her permission to continue. I began to notice how this silence seeped into every part of our lives. At work, I caught myself hesitating before voicing opinions, as though Claire's invisible hand reached beyond the wedding and into my daily routines. With friends outside the bridal circle, I found myself withholding details, embarrassed by the absurdity of what I was enduring. Even alone, I questioned whether my anger was valid, whether I was simply too sensitive, too unwilling to play along with what others had already accepted. Silence has a way of reshaping you, of convincing you that perhaps the problem is not the demand, but your own inability to meet it. And yet, in quiet moments, I sensed that the silence was not as unanimous as it appeared. There were hesitations in the chat, small delays before someone responded, as though they were weighing their words carefully, deciding how much truth to suppress. There were emojis used in strange ways, laughter that seemed forced, hearts sent not out of love but as currency to buy safety. It was as though we were all trapped in a play where Claire was both director and lead actress, and we, the unwilling cast, were mouthing lines we did not believe while the audience, whoever that might be, watched with eager eyes. I began to wonder what would happen if one of us broke the silence, if someone dared to say what we were all thinking. Would the others rally around her, relieved to finally release the words they had swallowed for so long, or would they turn on her, siding with Claire to protect themselves from the fallout? The thought haunted me, because I knew that silence not only concealed our suffering, but also isolated us, making us believe that we were alone in it. Claire had built her empire on that isolation, on the belief that none of us would risk becoming the outlier, the traitor, the one cast out. But silence, I realized, is not endless. It gathers weight, it builds pressure, and eventually it seeks release. For now, though, it continued, stretching across days and weeks, binding us together in a fragile agreement to say nothing, to do nothing, to endure everything. And Claire, oblivious to the fractures beneath the surface, continued to build her fantasy, unaware that the very silence she mistook for strength was the silence of women pushed past their limits, a silence that would not last forever. The morning of the wedding arrived cloaked in the kind of silence that feels heavy rather than peaceful, a silence that hangs in the air, not because the world is still, but because everyone within it has already surrendered. I woke before dawn, my stomach twisted in knots that refused to ease, the weight of weeks of rules and demands pressing on me as tangibly as the pale dress folded neatly in its garment bag. As I slipped it over my shoulders, its fabric clinging like a second skin, I no longer saw it as a symbol of celebration, but as a uniform of obedience, a costume designed to erase my individuality in service of someone else's vision. The mirror offered no comfort. My reflection was not my own, but a carefully sculpted outline of who Claire needed me to be, another cog in the wheel of her spectacle. I fastened the shoes she had dictated, jewelry dangling lightly but feeling heavy with its price, and with each step toward the door, I felt myself entering not a wedding, but a stage where the audience was the world, and the performance was perfection at any cost. At the salon, the atmosphere was suffocating, though not in the literal sense. The air smelled of hairspray, powders, and perfume, but beneath the chemical haze was a tension so thick it clung to the skin. We arrived one by one, each bridesmaid ushered to her chair as though we were livestock lined up for grooming, our names replaced by our roles. Stylists buzzed around us, speaking in clipped tones as they applied layer after layer of makeup, brushes moving with mechanical precision. their hands steady as if they had rehearsed this scene countless times. The makeup was not meant to enhance us, but to transform us, to make us match one another, to erase difference until we were identical dolls painted in the same shade of artificial beauty. The cost of this transformation, $850 each, echoed in my mind with every stroke of the brush, every sweep of the powder, every lash glued meticulously in place. I glanced around the room, searching for recognition in the eyes of the others, but what I saw was not recognition. It was resignation. Jenna sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her jaw clenched as a stylist contoured her cheekbones into sharpness. Melissa stared blankly ahead, her eyes glazed, as if she had chosen to leave her body behind to endure what her wallet could not justify. Sarah fidgeted slightly, her lips pressed together in a line so thin I thought it might disappear altogether. We were all there, present in form but absent in spirit, each one swallowed by the weight of silence that had defined these weeks, each one painting compliance across her face while the voice of protest rotted inside her chest. And then there was Claire. She floated into the salon hours later, her presence heralded by the hush that fell over the room. Dressed in silk and bathed in the glow of her own importance, she surveyed us with the critical eye of a director examining her cast. She smiled, but it was not a smile of affection. It was a smile of satisfaction, the kind a collector wears when admiring the pieces of a completed set. "Perfect," she said, walking slowly among us, her gaze darting from face to face, checking for flaws, for deviations, for cracks in the mask she had so carefully ordered. When she reached me, her hand brushed my shoulder lightly, almost mockingly, as she whispered, "See? Worth every penny." Her words landed like stones, and though I kept my expression neutral, inside I wanted to scream. It was not worth a penny, not worth a fraction of the dignity we had each surrendered, but to her, our submission was priceless. The ceremony itself was a blur, a parade of rituals performed not for love, but for spectacle. We walked in line, our steps synchronized, our smiles frozen, our faces glowing under the weight of products we had not chosen but had been forced to pay for. Guests whispered about how stunning we looked, how flawless the bridal party appeared, and I wanted to shake them, to scream that what they saw was not beauty, but captivity. The applause rang hollow, every cheer another reminder of the cost hidden behind the glittering surface. Claire basked in it all, her gown trailing like a conquering queen's robe, her face illuminated with triumph. She had achieved her vision, and we were the canvas upon which she had painted it, unwilling and yet unresisting. By the time the reception began, my skin itched beneath the layers of foundation, the weight of false lashes dragging at my eyelids, lipstick cracking with every forced smile. I felt suffocated in my own body, trapped behind the mask she had ordered me to wear. As I sat at the long table, laughter and music swelling around me, I realized the cruelty of it all was not only in the price, but in the erasure. Claire had taken more than money. She had taken identity, voice, and choice. She had stripped us of individuality and remade us into ornaments, tools to elevate her own radiance, and we had allowed it, too afraid to break the silence, too afraid to ruin the illusion. That night, when I returned home and finally scrubbed the layers of makeup from my face, watching the colors smear and swirl down the sink, I felt an emptiness settle in me, heavier than anything I had carried before. My reflection returned slowly, ghostly beneath the raw skin, and I stared at myself for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in the mirror with the doll that had stood beside Claire all day. I realized then that the cost was never truly about $850. It was about submission. It was about how much we were willing to give before something inside us broke. And though none of us had said it yet, though none of us had dared to speak the truth aloud, I knew a fracture had formed in all of us. A fracture that would not heal with time, because the performance of beauty had not only stolen from our wallets, but had carved into our souls, leaving us marked by the knowledge of how easily we had been bought, and how willingly we had been sold. The wedding had passed, leaving behind the hollow echo of laughter that did not belong to us, photographs that froze our smiles into lifeless perfection, and memories that tasted bitter despite their glittering facade. For a brief moment, I thought the ordeal might be over, that the demands had reached their crescendo with the ceremony, and would dissolve into silence once the spectacle was complete. But Claire was not the kind of woman to release her grip so easily. Control, for her, was not bound to the altar or the vows. It lingered, stretching into every corner of our lives, and it revealed itself most clearly in the days that followed, when the first bills began to arrive. I remember opening my inbox one morning to find an email marked Makeup Services Invoice. My stomach tightened as I clicked, the subject line alone enough to send a chill through me. The document was neatly formatted, the total written in bold black type, $850. I had been prepared for it, had braced myself for weeks, telling myself that though the cost was absurd, at least it was finite. I had paid more than I could justify, but I believed, naively, that the nightmare was finally contained. Yet as I scrolled through the details, a prickle of unease crept along my skin. The charges did not stop at the base fee. There were add-ons I had never agreed to. Premium lashes, special contouring, hydrating treatment. Each line item stacked neatly on top of the last, small amounts that snowballed into something larger, something that made me blink in disbelief. The final total read $1,020. It was not catastrophic, not yet, but it was the first sign that what Claire had promised was not what we had been given. I stared at the list of services, trying to recall whether I had ever been asked if I wanted any of them, whether the stylist had even mentioned what she was doing as she worked. I remembered sitting there, motionless, while brushes and powders swept across my face, decisions made without my consent, my silence treated as agreement. It struck me then that silence was not only what Claire demanded, but what her entire world was built on. It was a currency, one she spent freely, assuming that our lack of protest meant permission. I reached out to Jenna, wondering if her bill looked the same. She hesitated before replying, finally sending me a screenshot of her invoice. 1,050. Different add-ons, same pattern. Melissa's was $995, Sarah's $100. Each of us had been billed differently, as if the numbers had been plucked from the air, manipulated to keep us guessing, to keep us from uniting in protest. It was clever in its cruelty, scattering us with uneven weights so that none of us bore the same burden, ensuring that comparison would breed confusion rather than solidarity. When I suggested that something was wrong, Jenna only shrugged in her message, typing, "It's not worth the fight. Just pay it." That sentence lingered with me far longer than the bill itself. Not worth the fight. It was the mantra of the bridesmaids, the justification we whispered to ourselves when the demands grew unbearable. But how many times could we repeat it before we were buried beneath its weight? How much could we endure before silence became indistinguishable from surrender? I considered writing back to the vendor, questioning the charges, but the email address at the bottom of the invoice redirected to a name I recognized instantly: Claire. She had not simply chosen the vendor. She was the vendor. Or at least she had entwined herself so tightly with the business that any protest would land not in the hands of an impartial party, but directly back at her feet. And I knew what her response would be: ridicule, humiliation, another reminder that if we could not pay, we should not have come. The trap was complete. The circle closed. I paid the bill, my hands trembling as I entered the numbers into the payment screen. It felt less like settling a debt, and more like sealing a pact, binding myself further into her control. As the confirmation message appeared, a wave of nausea rolled over me, not only at the money lost, but at the realization that this was only the beginning. If she could add charges here, she could add them anywhere. If she could stretch one bill beyond its limits, she could stretch them all, pulling us thinner and thinner until there was nothing left to take. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, the dress still hanging limp in my closet like a ghost, I thought about how small the increments had been at first: 850, 995, 1,020, none of them devastating on their own, but each one a chisel strike against our stability, each one a reminder that Claire's hunger was not for money alone, but for obedience, for the proof that she could demand, and we would give, that she could take, and we would remain silent. The first strange bill was not just a number on a page. It was a warning, a glimpse into the shape of the storm that had only begun to form, a storm that promised to strip away far more than dollars, a storm that would test just how much dignity we were willing to sacrifice before someone, anyone, finally broke the silence. I had thought the first inflated invoice was the worst of it, that the uneasy silence around the smaller discrepancies would be the last insult we would be forced to swallow, but I underestimated the depths of Claire's greed and the reach of her control. The bill arrived days later, not as a neat email this time, but as a thick envelope slid beneath my door, the kind of envelope that carried the weight of legal documents or official summons. Its edges were stiff, its seal unbroken, and for a moment, I simply stared at it lying on the floor, dread curdling in my stomach. I knew before I even touched it that whatever was inside would not be fair, that it would not be just another demand for makeup or services, but something worse, something that would strip the last layer of rationalization I had clung to. When I finally bent down and tore it open, the air in the room seemed to shift, as though the walls themselves recoiled at the audacity of what I was holding. The numbers swam before my eyes at first, so absurd that my mind refused to accept them. $15,250. The total glared up at me in bold type, unforgiving and undeniable, each digit a knife sinking deeper into my chest. I blinked, convinced I must have read it wrong, but the figure remained, unrelenting. Beneath it was a list of charges, line after line of fabricated services, multiple makeup sessions, exclusive packages, extended hours, even a handful of bridal enhancements that clearly had nothing to do with me. It was as though the vendor, or rather Claire, had taken every name in the bridal party and funneled their expenses into mine, stacking them together until the weight collapsed onto a single set of shoulders. My shoulders. I clutched the paper so tightly that it crumpled, my knuckles white, my breath shallow. The room seemed to tilt around me, the floor shifting under my feet. I had prepared myself for another petty theft, another few hundred siphoned away with a smile and a threat. But this was theft on a scale that could ruin me, theft that reached beyond inconvenience into the territory of devastation. My first instinct was to call the number at the bottom of the bill, to demand an explanation, but the name that stared back at me was the same as before: Claire. The business was hers, the vendor hers, the invoice nothing more than a mask to cover her manipulation. There was no impartial authority to appeal to, no one outside her web to intervene. She had orchestrated this perfectly, leaving me trapped with a choice that was no choice at all: pay or be destroyed by her wrath. I sank into a chair, the paper trembling in my hands, the silence of my home suddenly oppressive. It wasn't just the number that froze my blood. It was the knowledge that Claire had done this deliberately, that she had looked at me and decided I was the one to bear the burden, the one who could be crushed without consequence. She had taken advantage of the same silence she had cultivated in us all, weaponizing it now to shift her own costs onto me, confident that I would not fight back, that I would not dare to speak. The cruelty of it was not in the money alone, but in the precision of her calculation, the way she had singled me out and left me isolated, her victim dressed in gold letters and false smiles. I thought of the others, of Jenna and Melissa and Sarah, and wondered if they had received anything similar. My phone sat heavy in my lap, the urge to reach out battling against the fear of what I might learn. If their bills were smaller, would they believe me, or would they think I was exaggerating? If theirs were the same, would they admit it, or would they retreat again into silence, too frightened to confront her? The thought of exposing myself and being met with disbelief made me hesitate, and in that hesitation, I felt the trap close tighter. Claire had not only stolen money, she had stolen trust, leaving me doubting even the women who had stood beside me in identical dresses, our faces painted into masks of compliance. As the hours stretched on, I felt the weight of the bill pressing into me like a physical force. I imagined what would happen if I refused to pay, the humiliation Claire would unleash, the lies she would spread, the way she would twist the story until I became the villain, the bridesmaid too cheap, too petty, too disloyal to honor her day. The fear of that narrative burned hotter than the fear of debt, because I knew how quickly people sided with her, how easily they swallowed the poison of her charm. She would destroy me socially, professionally, perhaps even personally, and she would do it with the same effortless smile she wore when she whispered, "Worth every penny." But beneath the fear, something else stirred, something darker and sharper than anything I had felt before. Anger. Not the fleeting frustration I had carried through the earlier demands, not the silent resentment that had eaten at me during the ceremony, but a deep, simmering fury that grew with every reread of that number, every glance at the fabricated charges. $15,250. It was more than greed. It was cruelty elevated to art, a performance of control so brazen it could no longer be ignored. In that moment, as my hands shook and my heart pounded, I realized that Claire had overplayed her hand. By pushing so far, by demanding so much, she had broken the silence she had worked so hard to cultivate. I folded the bill carefully, pressing its creases flat, and set it on the table before me. My mind raced, not with panic but with calculation, each thought sharpening into a plan. If Claire wanted to play with numbers, I would give her numbers she could not erase. If she wanted to turn silence into a weapon, I would break it in a way she could never anticipate. For the first time since that golden invitation had arrived, I felt something close to clarity. Claire had turned her wedding into a stage, her bridesmaids into actors, her demands into scripts. But what she had forgotten was that even actors can improvise, and sometimes the scene ends not with applause, but with exposure. The bill that froze my blood would not be the end of me. It would be the beginning of her unraveling. The decision to confront Claire did not arrive in a moment of impulsive rage, but rather in the slow accumulation of sleepless nights, hours spent staring at the folded bill that still lay on my table like a venomous thing, daring me to ignore it. Every time I walked past it, the bold numbers seemed to rise from the page and carve themselves into the air. 15,250. It no longer felt like just a debt. It felt like a scar branded into my name, a mark that would follow me until I answered it. And yet, what finally propelled me toward her was not just the money, but the realization that if I remained silent, I would forever carry the role she had assigned me, the obedient bridesmaid, the compliant pawn, the woman too weak to fight back. I could not allow her to win in silence, so I chose to speak, even if my voice trembled. I asked her to meet me in a cafe that neither of us favored, a place neutral and anonymous where her performance would not be bolstered by familiar faces. When she arrived, her presence filled the room in the way it always did, her posture regal, her clothing pristine, her eyes scanning the space as if to measure its worth before sitting. She greeted me with a smile, but it was a smile that belonged on stage, practiced and brittle, as if she already anticipated a scene and was prepared to play her role flawlessly. I slid the envelope across the table before either of us had spoken a word. Her fingers rested on it lightly, as though she already knew its contents, as though it were not a revelation but a script she had written herself. "I'm not paying this," I said, my voice quiet but firm, the words tasting foreign as they left my mouth. It was the first time I had defied her directly, and for a heartbeat, I felt the power of it ripple through me. Claire's smile did not falter, but her eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation breaking the surface of her composure. "You already agreed," she replied smoothly, her voice a velvet blade. "The services were provided. If you cannot honor your commitments, perhaps you should not have accepted the honor of being a bridesmaid." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with the ease of someone who had delivered this line many times before, who had relied on guilt and shame to bend others into submission. "This isn't my bill," I answered, sliding the papers closer to her. "Half of these charges don't even belong to me. You've piled everyone's costs onto my name." I felt my pulse racing, but I refused to look away, refused to let her gaze reduce me to silence as it had before. Claire tilted her head, her smile stretching wider, crueler. "Do you have proof? Can you show me where you didn't receive those services? Do you have recordings, receipts, witnesses?" Her voice dripped with mockery, each question designed to unravel me, to remind me that in her world, power did not belong to the truth, but to the story she could spin. Around us, the cafe continued its quiet hum, cups clinking, soft conversations floating, but in that moment, it felt as though the room had shrunk to just the two of us, predator and prey, silence waiting to see who would break first. I don't need proof, I said slowly, surprising even myself with the steadiness of my tone. Because this isn't about services. It's about control, and I won't play your game anymore. For a moment, something in her expression faltered. Her smile cracked just slightly, enough for me to glimpse the fury simmering beneath. She leaned forward then, her voice lowering into a hiss meant only for me. Careful. You think you can stand against me, but you'll only humiliate yourself. Do you know how many people adore me? How quickly I could turn them against you? One word, and you'll be the bitter bridesmaid who couldn't handle her responsibilities. You'll be the joke everyone remembers when they look at those photos. Her words struck like blows, but beneath them, I felt the anger within me harden into something unmovable. The fear that had once paralyzed me was gone, burned away by the sheer audacity of her threat. I realized then that her power had always been built on intimidation, on the assumption that none of us would dare to expose her, and perhaps until now she had been right. But the bill in my hands was too much, too blatant, too cruel. You've underestimated me, I told her, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. And you've underestimated everyone else too. People are not as blind as you think. They'll see what you've done when it's laid in front of them. They'll see the truth. For the first time, Claire's mask slipped entirely. Her smile vanished, her eyes flashing with naked anger. She reached for the envelope, snatching it back as though its mere presence on the table exposed her. You don't know what you're doing, she spat, her voice sharp and venomous. You'll regret this. But as I watched her storm out of the cafe, her heels striking hard against the tile, I knew she was the one who had reason to fear. The confrontation had not ended the battle. It had only begun it. She had tried to silence me with threats, but in doing so, she had revealed the weakness at the heart of her power. It only worked when we obeyed. And now, I no longer intended to. The bill that froze my blood had been her boldest move, her attempt to break me entirely, but in that attempt she had fractured the silence that once protected her. I felt it in my chest as I left the cafe, a slow burning fire that refused to be extinguished. The confrontation had not solved everything, but it had shifted the ground beneath us. The stage she had built was beginning to crack, and soon it would collapse under the weight of the truth. The confrontation with Claire had left me shaken, but not in the way she intended. Her threats, once sharp enough to cut me into silence, now sounded hollow, stripped of their menace by the sheer absurdity of the bill she had placed on my shoulders. Fear had been her weapon, silence her shield, and both were beginning to splinter. I knew then that my private refusal was not enough. If I let the battle remain hidden between us, she would twist the narrative, as she always did, and cast me as the bitter bridesmaid unworthy of her grace. She thrived in secrecy, in whispered threats, and isolated shame. To break her, the truth had to leave the shadows. Exposure would be the only language she could not control. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. A week after our meeting, she hosted a post-wedding brunch, a gathering designed to parade her triumph one final time. Families, friends, and the bridal party were all invited, a carefully selected audience meant to admire her, to sip champagne and marvel at the perfection of her orchestrated dream. I considered refusing the invitation, but then I realized that this was the stage she had built for herself, and it would be the perfect place to dismantle it. I arrived with the bill folded neatly in my purse, my heart pounding against my ribs with every step toward the venue. The room was awash with light and laughter, the tables draped in linens, the air filled with the sound of glasses clinking, and Claire's voice carrying above the rest as she floated from group to group. She wore her victory like a crown, radiant in her certainty that everyone still adored her. Her bridesmaids sat together at one side of the room, smiling faintly, their laughter brittle, their eyes dim with exhaustion. They had survived her demands, but their silence still weighed on them like chains. I realized then that this was not just about me. If I exposed her, I would not only free myself, but perhaps them as well. When the moment came, it was almost too easy. Claire had gathered everyone's attention with a toast, her glass raised high, her words dripping with gratitude and self-congratulation. None of this would have been possible without the love and support of those closest to me, she declared, her eyes sweeping over us as though daring us to contradict her. The room erupted in applause, and she basked in it, her smile wide and polished. It was then that I stood, my legs trembling but my voice steadier than I expected. "I wonder," I said, loud enough for the room to hush, "if your guests would still applaud if they knew what their admiration cost." The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating, every eye turning toward me. Claire's smile faltered, her glass hovering midair as she blinked at me, a flicker of panic flashing across her face before the mask returned. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone laced with false innocence. I reached into my purse and pulled out the bill, unfolding it slowly, deliberately, until the pages stretched wide. $15,250, I said, my voice cutting through the air. That's what Claire billed me for makeup after her wedding. Not just my makeup. Everyone's. She piled it all under my name and expected me to pay for the entire scheme. I held the papers up so they were visible, the bold numbers glaring under the light. Gasps rippled through the room, whispers sparking like flames. Claire's composure cracked then. "That's ridiculous," she snapped, her smile gone, her eyes darting toward the crowd as though to reel them back under her spell. "She's exaggerating. She doesn't understand how these things work. It's just a mistake on the invoice." "It's not a mistake," I interrupted, my words sharp, unwavering. "I have proof. Screenshots of the invoices the other bridesmaids received. Each one different. Each one inflated. Each one designed to confuse us. And the business?" I let the words hang for a moment, savoring the collective anticipation. "It's hers. Claire wasn't just dictating our appearance. She was profiting from it. Every one of us paid her directly, under the guise of professional services, when in reality she was funneling money from her friends into her own pocket." The room erupted then, voices overlapping in disbelief, anger, shock. Guests turned to each other, murmuring accusations and questions, their admiration curdling into contempt. Claire's family looked stricken, her new husband stiff and pale beside her, his hand frozen around his glass. The bridesmaids stared at me wide-eyed, their silence finally shattered, their expressions shifting from fear to something closer to relief. For the first time, they saw someone speak the truth aloud, and in that moment, the spell Claire had cast began to unravel. She tried to recover, to shout over the noise, but the words tumbled out desperate and defensive. They agreed. They all agreed. If they couldn't afford it, they shouldn't have come. But the damage was done. The words that once silenced us now condemned her, echoing through the crowd like a confession. The applause that had filled the room only moments before was gone, replaced by the low rumble of outrage, the sound of an empire collapsing. I stood there, my heart racing, the bill trembling slightly in my hands. But I no longer felt fear. What I felt was release, the kind that comes not from winning a battle but from ending a war you never chose to fight. Claire had built her kingdom on silence, but exposed to the light, it crumbled in an instant. And as I watched her sputter and flail, surrounded not by adoration but by suspicion and disgust, I knew that the next steps, the implosion of her carefully crafted image, the unraveling of her marriage, the loss of the power she had wielded so cruelly, were inevitable. For the first time since that golden invitation arrived at my door, I felt free. The aftermath of the brunch was not immediate chaos, but a slow, creeping collapse, the kind that begins with murmurs and grows into something impossible to contain. Claire had always been careful with her image, crafting it meticulously, like the edges of her invitations, or the curls in her hair. But once the truth had been spoken aloud and the numbers laid bare, the cracks widened faster than she could conceal them. I watched her stand there, her cheeks flushed, her voice rising above the crowd in frantic bursts of denial, but her words fell flat. They were no longer commands or threats. They were excuses, flimsy and transparent, dissolving under the weight of witnesses who had seen too much. The room that had once applauded her every gesture now looked at her with suspicion, and in their eyes I saw something I had longed for, but never thought I'd see: doubt. The first to break their silence were not her friends or family, but the bridesmaids themselves. Jenna, who had once whispered her fears to me in a grocery store line, spoke up from across the room, her voice trembling but clear. "She's right. My bill was over $1,000, and half of it was things I never asked for. Melissa nodded quickly, fumbling with her phone until she held up her screen, displaying her own invoice for everyone to see. Mine too. Different charges, same pattern. Sarah added her voice, quiet but resolute, confessing that she had been too afraid to say anything before, afraid of being cast out or humiliated. One by one, the women Claire had silenced began to speak, their voices rising in strength as they realized they were no longer alone. The room that once echoed with false laughter now resonated with truth, and the collective weight of it pressed down on Claire like a judgment she could not escape. Her husband stood rigid beside her, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the documents, the phones, and the faces of the women who had once been paraded as ornaments of his wife's control. I saw the moment realization struck him, the way his posture stiffened, the way his hand slowly released the glass he held as if it had burned him. His gaze shifted to Claire, and whatever affection or loyalty he had carried into their marriage seemed to wither in an instant. He said nothing, but the silence between them was louder than any accusation. In that silence, she lost the only ally she might have claimed. News of the confrontation spread quickly. By the end of the day, messages were already circulating among mutual friends, posts appearing on social media, whispers turning into declarations, screenshots of invoices, fragments of group chats, testimonies from bridesmaids. All of it spilled into the open, piecing together a story too consistent to deny. Claire tried to counter it, of course. She posted her own version, painting herself as a misunderstood bride, a victim of bitter women who resented her success. But the more she spoke, the more hollow her words became. Because now there were receipts, tangible evidence that her empire had been built on exploitation. Her reputation, once polished to a blinding shine, tarnished rapidly, each new revelation another stain she could not scrub away. For me, the liberation was not in watching her fall, though there was a grim satisfaction in seeing her stripped of the power she had wielded so carelessly, but in the bond that formed among the women she had tried to pit against one another. The bridesmaids, once isolated in silence, found their voices together. Jenna laughed for the first time without bitterness, saying she felt lighter knowing she wasn't crazy, that what she had sensed all along was real and shared. Melissa spoke openly about how close she had been to maxing out her credit card just to keep up with Claire's demands, and Sarah confessed that she had lost sleep for weeks, terrified of disappointing her. In our shared honesty, we found a strength that had been denied to us before. We were no longer actors in Claire's play. We were the audience that had turned on the performance, and in that turning, we reclaimed ourselves. Claire's world did not implode in a single day. It unraveled piece by piece. Vendors she had worked with began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with scandal. Friends stopped answering her calls, their loyalty dissolving when they realized how disposable they had always been to her. Family members who had once defended her fell silent, their trust eroded by the weight of proof. Even her marriage, fresh and gilded, began to show signs of strain, her husband's patience fraying in the face of whispers and accusations. The woman who once commanded silence found herself surrounded by it, but this time it was not compliance. It was abandonment. As for me, I found a strange kind of peace in the quiet that followed. The golden invitation still sat on my shelf, its edges dulled now, its glamour gone. I kept it not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of what I had endured and overcome. For months, I had carried the weight of Claire's cruelty, believing myself powerless against it. But in the end, it was the truth, simple and undeniable, that had shattered her facade. The cost of beauty had been measured not in dollars but in dignity, and though she had tried to strip it from us, she had failed. The liberation of the bridesmaids was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but by something quieter, steadier. It was in the way Jenna spoke more freely, the way Melissa smiled without fear, the way Sarah's laughter no longer carried the edge of exhaustion. It was in the way we looked at one another and knew we had survived something together, something that had tested the limits of our silence and forced us to find our voices. Claire had fallen, and in her fall, she had freed us. And me? I was no longer the woman who had once trembled at the thought of defiance. I was no longer the bridesmaid who had accepted demands wrapped in gold ink. I was someone else now, someone who had faced down cruelty, who had spoken when silence was safer, who had chosen truth over fear. The bill that had once frozen my blood no longer haunted me. It had become the spark that lit a fire too bright for Claire's shadows to contain. In the end, it was not about the makeup, or the dresses, or even the $15,000. It was about reclaiming what she had tried to take. Our voices, our dignity, our choice. And as Claire faded into the background, her empire of silence crumbling into dust, we walked away, not as victims, but as women who had faced the weight of cruelty and emerged unbroken. That was the true liberation, the ending she had never scripted, the finale she could never control.